So we've done the usability and the perception. We'll look at the persuasive and the will-do components now. The reason why I like this is it's not just now this kind of polishing stuff. It's not just making access to stuff. This is really making people compel. It's making people reduce their procrastination and actually be willing to press a button, to buy something, to engage with you. It's compelling them to actually take an action, so it's really good. But it's great because it's based on science and it's proper stuff. It's not just kind of hand-wavy. There are established rules in the same way that there are for the perceptual elements. There are some interesting subtleties. So the way that different persuasive elements can go together and combine into a kind of old strategic whole is really kind of interesting to go through. So you can apply it tactically, so you can improve just designs and make them immediately more persuasive. But overall, if you're trying to create an overall experience, you can build in different subtle cues to create a really persuasive flow or interaction. And that's kind of why I really like it. It can also fit in with user-centered design and usability and those kind of things that we were talking about, and it's readily applicable to these kind of processes. The whole kind of subject of persuasion is not particularly new. So these are Second World War propaganda posters. So everyone has often known about the powerful effects of visual media and persuasive media and messages on people. What's nice about it as well is it's not particularly easy. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it, and we kind of have a base level. There'd be no point really focusing on it. This is Oxford, where I live. These are called loiter-proof benches. They cost about 90 grand a piece. All right, you can see that they're curved here because they want to stop youths, mainly, hanging about outside these offices and also the shops. This is the main shopping street in Oxford. So it's important to test things as well, much like we did on the perceptual elements. It's no good just having your idea. You need to actually test how it's going to be used in practice. It's not particularly easy getting these things right, so you've got to do it with intent and actually test what you're doing. I just love that. The good thing about this is it all has a strong recent history. So Kahneman, with his prospect theory, won the Nobel Prize. So effectively what he was doing was exploring cognitive biases and using those to explain how the markets work, because prior to him it wasn't really known why the market didn't behave as a rational being. It wasn't apparent why people didn't make rational decisions on economic judgments. So he explained all of that in his theory, and these other thinkers are really taking those ideas and extended and researching them, but they're all based on cognitive biases effectively. So this is Bob Cialdini. I'll be talking about some of his stuff shortly. He's a Stanford professor. This is Dan Ariely. I think he's a Stanford professor as well now, isn't he? Was at University of Jerusalem for a while, but I think he's gone there. And another Stanford professor. For some reason there's kind of Stanford going on. BJ Fogg talks a lot about persuasion and particularly persuasive technologies. There's some brilliant, if you want to look at some brilliant TED videos by Dan Ariely, and a fantastic book called Predictably Irrational, which I encourage you all to read. It's a fantastic read. I'm going to talk briefly about some of this guy's stuff, and I'll show you a model of his, but I haven't got time to go into it any more than that. The great thing is that they're all based on the same kind of thing. It's shortcuts that we use as human beings to get around in the world and make decisions on things. But once you know the rules, you can start manipulating them to create the effects that you want. And there's some books on this as well. So I'd encourage you to probably read that one by Cialdini and Predictably Irrational by Ariely. So Cialdini had 6 persuasion principles. Reciprocity, which is simply, if I give you something, and actually you'll notice we've given you Bunnyfoot pens and Bunnyfoot post-it notes in case any of you are prospective clients. If I give you something, it doesn't matter that it has limited amount of worth. Us as human beings have a psychological anxiety and a need to give something back. And usually it occurs that the thing that people give back happens to be more than the original gift, which is kind of interesting. I'll show you an example of that in a bit. Scarcity, things that are scarce tend to be perceived as having more value and more valuable, and people want to get them. We're also loss averse as well. We tend to do what authority figures tell us to do, even now. We have an intrinsic idea about who we are and what our past behaviours have done, and we like to do things that are consistent with those past behaviours. What this means is if you can get someone to do something small with you once, it's a lot easier to get them to do more of it the next time and to get them to do it again, the kind of foot in the door phenomenon. Social proof, we're all sheep basically. So we do what everyone else is doing. You might notice that when I was trying to get everyone into here, I was trying to do a little experiment with you to see if I could get a couple of people in here and that the groundswell would start to bring everyone in here. It didn't work in the end, I had to all shout at you. So it doesn't always work, but I'll explain more about that soon. And likability, we tend to be more persuaded by people we like, people who make us laugh, and people who are more like us as well. And there are rules that dictate the effectiveness of all of these things, which is nice. I'll just show you some examples. This is a really nice experiment that was done by Bob Caldini. It was a controlled experiment, controlled for different restaurants, controlled across lots of different trials, lots of different subjects, etc. And the basic setup was, what they did was they gave bills in different forms, so restaurant bills. So you might go over to your customer. This was an actor, and they had people watching and people analysing what the tip was. So that was the variable that they were measuring. So the independent variable was the form of the bill. So I'd come over and give you a bill, just like that, for your food, go off, do that lots of times for lots of different people, and they'd measure the average tip that you got from that. So that was condition 1. Condition 2 was add some mint imperials. Well, nowadays they don't add mint imperials, it tends to be Fox's Glacier mints because of the 37 different types of urine that you find on those. So it tends to be just Fox's Glacier mints nowadays. So I come over and I give you some mints with your bill as well. That's repeated across lots of people, and they measure the bill. And the bill goes up appreciably by just giving that small gift. And of course it goes up by more than the worth of your Fox's Glacier mints. Fox's Glacier mints are not worth anything, but your bill goes up appreciably by orders of pounds worth. So that's kind of interesting. That shows reciprocity, but it's not that interesting. What's interesting is the final condition, which is this one. And now what the researcher does, who's playing the waiter, they have your bill with some mints. In fact, I need another prop, more mints. They have your bill with the mints, and they give you those, and then they walk off. And then as you're still looking at them, they feign, give you a big cheesy smile, run back over to you, because you're so special. Here's some extra mints just for you. Big cheesy grin, bit of eye contact. There you go. They might even draw a little smiley on the bill and say thank you for all of that kind of stuff. So they're giving you the gift of consideration now, the gift of you being special. They're also giving you a few more worthless mints as well. But this sends your tip, or the average tip, sky high now. Far more powerful than just giving mints, far more powerful than just giving mints, that amount of mints anyway. It's that extra thought of you being special. Sends it sky high. So the take home of that is the gift doesn't necessarily have to be anything tangible. And in fact, thoughts and consideration tend to be more powerful than physical items. There's lots of different control studies done on that as well. Scarcity, my favourite experiment on this, again this is an old experiment from 1975, is the setup here is 2 cookie jars with identical biscuits or cookies. It was done in the US, in each jar. So you put these identical biscuits, 10 in one jar, 2 or 3 in the other jar. And you invite people in, and what they've got to do is taste one biscuit from each jar, and then they've got to rate whether jar A had the best biscuits, how succulent they were and whether they would buy them, or whether jar B had the best biscuits, which were succulent, whether they would buy one. And unsurprisingly, since we're talking about scarcity, the one with fewer biscuits, people actually perceive as being different and better and nicer and more succulent than they would buy them. And there's been all sorts of control experiments on this with other perceptual properties as well, things like taste of wine, things like the feeling of, there was one done on tights, and how lovely silk tights felt or something. The more scarce it is, the better it is always. Lots of different experiments done on that. It can be quite subtle, this effect. So can anyone see the scarcity here?
Today.
Yeah, the today. So there's a fundamental cognitive bias that we've got, which is to be loss averse. So even though today that's the price, it has a motivating fact and will increase conversions. Even though tomorrow could potentially be cheaper, because we're loss averse as human beings, we'll tend to think that it's going to be more expensive today, so we'd want to get that now. That's effective design. Anyone see it here?
Only 2 seats left.
Yeah, only 2 seats left. Extremely powerful design this was for British Airways at the time. There's an interesting problem with this design though. Can anyone spot it? It makes it less engaging, less believable. Well, it's probably too small for you to see here, but when it's shown like this, you can see that only 2 seats, only 2 seats, only 2 seats. It makes it less believable. But what's interesting about this is when you're, as a consumer, in buying mode, you're goal-driven to get that flight for, I don't know, the wedding or a business meeting or whatever it would be, you only see only 2 seats left. You probably don't read the rest, or even if you do, you don't interpret it. It actually says only 2 seats left at this price, book now to avoid disappointment. But what customers read is only 2 seats left, or what they perceive is only 2 seats left on this flight. And they think, I'm not going to get to my wedding. Nightmare. Press, 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 and they'll buy straight away. Even though actually it decreases the the believability because there's only 2 seats there. Because people are focused on a specific flight, they never kind of see that or so many of that. So it's still a very effective design. Okay, imagine you've just seen a cheesy infomercial and it's for an exercise machine or something like that. And at the end, they do one of these 2 messages. So operators are waiting, please call now, or if operators are busy, please call again. How many people, so which one's more effective? How many people think that one's more effective? Put your hands up. So a few people. How many people think that one's more effective? More of you. Good. This one's more effective by 34%. If, though, you ask people, consumers, which would you be most swayed by, everyone would say that one. And everyone would rationalise that, because it's going to make it easier for me. I don't want to phone again and all those kind of things. But when they tested this, this is 34% more effective. And in fact, the lady who's an American lady who was a direct marketing specialist who came up with this first was laughed out of town by her colleagues until they trialled it and actually found out that this is more effective. Why is this more effective?
Because it's scarce.
It's products are more popular.
Yeah. So it's doing 2 things. It's doing scarcity that we've just talked about. So potentially loads of people are ringing in for it as well. So it's going to be scarce resource that might run out, but also there's a social norming effect as well. If everyone's doing it, there must be something good about that. It creates like, the phones are ringing off. It must be an amazing thing that I want to get hold of. Whereas this one, you get the mental impression of a kind of, cold, dusty kind of warehouse, drafty warehouse, people doing their nails, etc. There's no real kind of urgency or anything that goes with that one, but that one's far more effective. Yeah, exactly. So there's an interesting thing about social norms. So there's a component of social norms in that one, which is a brilliant experiment. I love old experiments, so I'll just show you this one. This is Ash from 1951. The experiment here was really interesting. What you had to do was you have a look at the card with X on it, and your job is to say which of A, B or C is the same length as X. So how many people think it's A? How many people think it's B? How many people think it's C? Awesome, right, and that's about as hard as it gets. So it never gets any more difficult than that. So it's a really easy task. And if you test people with all sorts of ones, everyone pretty much gets, everyone pretty much gets 100%. It's really hard to get it wrong. Now the setup to this experiment is that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people take part in the experiment. 6 of them, though, are actors, and only 1 of them is the real subject of the experiment. And what they do is you show them this, and then you ask them, which A, B or C corresponds to X. And the first person goes C, 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 C. It's all fantastic. Yet on half of the trials, so 50%, they get it wrong on purpose, those first 6. And what you're doing is you're measuring the effect on that final person. Really interesting experiment. What they predicted that there would be few people that actually changed their mind, but it would probably have an effect. The results were roughly 86% of people on at least one trial, and a lot more than that, got the wrong answer. They wouldn't have got the wrong answer if they just did it by themselves, but because of this social effect, they got the wrong answer. And when they analysed it and tried to look into the reasons for this, there was 2 main reasons. One was a social compliance reason. People didn't want to appear stupid compared to all these other 6 people. They didn't want to stand out. And the second was the people actually questioned their own perception. So because of this powerful effect, they actually thought that the line length did change. And they were thinking, I must be wrong there. Everyone else has said A, it must be A. So it's a really powerful effect of social norms. There's another one on towels. So typical kind of message for hanging up your towel, a more social message. This works, it's thought, because it kind of shows what the default behaviour for people like you. It's probably people like you because they're staying in the hotel like you. Kind of interesting. If you show this one, which has a social component, you get 26% more towels hanging up and recycling. So that's kind of interesting, but as ever, the next one is even more interesting. So if you show this, which just says people who stayed in this room, you get an increased compliance. So there's no reason why people in this room should be more similar to you and show the more behaviour to you, but there's a kind of implied closeness to you, an implied closeness about the behaviour. And the interesting thing is when you explore any of this social effects, the more similar the person is to you exhibiting the behaviour, the more likely you're going to comply with that behaviour as well. It's kind of interesting effects here. Okay, remember anchoring. There's all sorts of different fun experiments. I showed one with you to begin with. There's anchoring, there's framing, there's all sorts of related things. How much would you pay for one of these? This is high-end instant coffee. How much would you pay for one of these jars? It makes about 25 cups, 30 cups. How much is a jar of coffee? £6. Sold to that man. Hands up who's got an espresso machine. Anyone got an espresso machine? Several of you have. How much is one of those?
30p, 29p.
29p. You're obviously buying them in bulk. 30p, 35p, something like that. So if you were to make the equivalent of those to that 30 jar cup of coffee, how much would that jar cost? It costs about 10 quid or something like that. And in fact, for different jars, it would cost a lot more. So you're paying 3-4 times as much for that as you would do for an actually equivalent tasting and sometimes better tasting coffee from the instant. So why do you do it? There's several reasons. Some of it is to do with the experience, but quite a large component is because your frame of reference has changed, and Nestle have been very clever in making sure that you have a changed frame of reference to compare what you're doing here with not an instant coffee in a jar and how much that's going to cost, but instead you compare it with the Starbucks experience. So now, rather than getting 4 times more expensive cup of coffee than you could have had at home, what you're getting is a Starbucks experience for 30p rather than 3 quid. So it's a really good way of framing that proposition. And we're very, very susceptible to these kind of different frames of reference. And there's lots of good stories about this. If you want to see a TED talk by Rory Sutherland, one of our friends, he's got some great stories. I won't repeat them here, but particularly good ones about, in fact, I won't go into those, they're a bit rude. Good ones about train journeys going to Paris, so you should look on that. Framing of wine lists within expensive restaurants. Always show the expensive wines first, and you up the average price of the bottles that they're going to buy. Toasters. Imagine going to John Lewis, and there's 2 toasters there, one at £10, one at £20. Roughly equal numbers of people buy each toaster. Then what you do is install one of these at £110. It's a dual lit fancy chrome one. Now what does everyone do? Everyone buys a 20 quid one. So you've doubled, well, almost doubled your income from that. Occasionally people buy that one, but you just use that as a decoy to raise the bar for everyone. So it's all about framing. And there's lots more effects that you can do with this, but I'm kind of running out of time. So the take home is there are rules around this, so you should design for the known rules of persuasion. Ideally, you can make it strategic rather than just tactical. And some of these work with each other. So we saw that with the phones example, for instance. But you need to make sure that you're not having conflicting messages. And you can test and also improve through that iterative cycle that we talked about before.